Well, delighted to be with you today. Across the country, we've had recent elections, of course, Saskatchewan for you, Nova Scotia. On average, we're seeing a 50% turnover on councils. And so today, what can we possibly do given that you've done this awesome orientation, I'm sure? So I thought maybe today it would be more about how could I provide some insights, some tools for the ongoing alignment of political administrative relations. So not a 101 session, but rather let's put some context to this arrangement, if you will, and explore some of the conditions, some of the context, some of the principles, and hopefully leave you with a tool for ongoing check-ins with your council. Where are these based? Well, they're based not just you have the insights of Saskatchewan. So I want to give you some of the insights of what's happening across the country. Where do they come from? Well, they come from the work that certainly I've done with councils and administrations all across the country, but as well from CAOs like yourself, and of course CEOs, mayors, wardens, chairs, and reeves all across the country. So not theoretical. So what do we hear from CAOs across the country? Well, in my work, not only the consultancy, but research in looking at the emerging leadership profile of CAOs, in particular, working on that in Ontario. And I've done around 150 or more interviews with CAOs. And what do I hear? Well, I hear alignment, of course, and it's probably increasingly an overused term, but nevertheless, what does that mean when we say alignment? Well, there's two aspects for the CAO. One, behavioral alignment around the leadership requirements. Are we meeting the political expectations around a leader? And of course, those greatly vary. They vary from time to time. They vary from not only from election to election, but they also vary from time to time, day in, day out. As well, of course, strategy. As a CAO, are we aligned strategically with the directions, which some here, especially when there is a CAO who departs. Often I'll hear the words, "we weren't aligned." And so what does that mean and how does it look? Well, let's take a look at strategic alignment. Strategic alignment, of course, we have very significant, what I call wicked challenges, social challenges facing your community, whether it's policing, whether it's housing, dealing with homeless, medical services, drugs and alcohol abuse, etc. Of course, we also have environmental issues, and whether that's dramatic events such as flooding or fires, issues around waste management, climate change, and looking at energy, whether it's conservation or production of alternate energy. Of course, we'd be remiss, in particular right now, if we didn't mention the economy, and the economy even before COVID, whether it's diversification of existing core industries, for example, agriculture or resource extraction, for example, which is a good part of Saskatchewan, or whether it's the viability of our core areas or center areas with retail leakage and sort of the whole viability of the downtown. And what about more people working from home or young entrepreneurs? Where do we enable them to have space to be able to be a productive part of society and contribute in an economic way? As well, of course, we have infrastructure. So if we've got this, so far we have environmental issues coming down on us. We have social issues on our organization. We have economic, but pushing up, we have our infrastructure, our aging infrastructure. And so whether that is making sure we have a room for growth, for example, doing some work in Yorkton, and I'm sure other communities all across the country. Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the water and the capacity for growth? As more and more people want to move from larger centers and come to our smaller communities, do we have that capacity? And I know that's, for example, an issue in White City as well. Or do we need to look at how do we become more efficient and effective in our core services, water, roads, maintenance, et cetera, public works, often called public works, and look for innovation, for example, here in this subdivision, using AstroTurf instead of grass. And of course, we know very much the asset management dilemma, depending on where you are, that burden of replacing the existing infrastructure. With all this, we have other factors as well, whether that be downloading new requirements for public safety, environmental regulations, et cetera. But the one that I find even equally troubling is offloading. Offloading, what's that? Well, offloading is everybody is trying to rationalize their services, and so some services just aren't being provided. They're being centralized. They're not available in your community. Face this, but we see it all across the country. Nova Scotia amalgamation, Quebec amalgamation, Ontario, Manitoba. In other areas, we're seeing what they call viability studies. We've got that happening in PEI, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and I think maybe even in Saskatchewan. And in Alberta, we have a different initiative, which is around I think it's a bit of an oxymoron, but legislated collaboration. So all municipalities are required within a certain period to have proven that they have undertaken and achieved a collaboration agreement. Interestingly, right now, of course, that was about two and a half years ago, and we now have 30 pairs of municipalities in Alberta, at least, in arbitration. A shame. Well, not only that, but we have the unexpected. Whether it's a disaster, something problematic, or in fact something very, very unique, a unique opportunity. For example, in northern BC, a major development called Site C. It might be a new mine, new opportunity. But as well, we also have what I call the squirrels. Working with one municipality in Nova Scotia, they have new council, of course, after an election, 50% turnover. They have a ward system, right? So districts. And so people are coming with things coming from their citizens. So they might have a strategic plan, but every meeting, there's the squirrels. I don't want to call them squirrels, but they're important to somebody, right? They're important to one counselor. They're important to one individual. And we need opportunities to be able to figure those, how do we handle those? So what are the implications? Okay, well, that's the world we live in. We are the front line. There's no other level of government. Indigenous communities, of course, First Nations, Métis. We're the front line of all the requirements. And so what's that mean? Well, what we're seeing across the country, and haven't been one place yet that says, "Bring it on." We're looking more. We're looking for more stuff to do. So as a new council comes in with those expectations, just from an election, and the capacity is full day in, day out, the services. And so we're seeing across the country, put on top of that, of course, COVID, a staff, a stress, burnout, fatigue. And what happens with that, of course, it reduces the culture, it reduces the innovative culture. And so wanting to make sure that we somehow manage expectations to manage our capacity. Amidst all this, we see demands don't diminish. And whether they're subtle demands, for example, people wanting what we see across the country is people moving from urban areas to smaller areas and wanting those same services that they had in the urban area, sort of that access to perhaps recreation facilities and, dare I say, pickleball, something like that. But as well, we have that kind of demand for services. For example, perhaps increased property crime across the country, with people perhaps who are economically challenged. We have more theft, and so people want more police presence. And so we have sort of the demand for more services in one way, but we also have sort of this protests or anger for services in another way. Well, where do we end up with that? Well, I suspect that although local government, according to some polls, is kind of the grassroots and has more respect or confidence than other levels of government, and so it's not a contest, but let me just put it in perspective. It's possible that we're seeing a diminished confidence in local government. And I don't mean trust. I think trust is the wrong word. Sure, we have ethical issues, et cetera, but I think it's more confidence in the ability of council, local government, to be able to deal with issues. And we're certainly seeing that with COVID right now, local government's being on the front line. So a diminished public confidence, and that affects the ego, that affects the ability of local governments to be bold, to do things if they're always trying to make sure they're satisfying the public. We also have what I call the revenue chase. 4,000 local governments in the country. As we have more demands, if we haven't really effectively managed expectations with services, the answer is find more money. Well, unfortunately, we have taxpayer fatigue, in particular, more pronounced right now. And so we have what I call the revenue chase, looking for grants, 4,000 local governments looking for grants that nobody else has found, or waiting for the new round. Often grants that are tied to projects that weren't even on our priority list, but chasing the money. We also have efforts to wrap but we're now also seeing other services. And so, for example, in Quebec, sponsoring of ambulances. And, for example, Comox sponsors on fire trucks and fire equipment. As well as we see this 50% turnover across the country, I'm sensing two kind of schools of thought. And again, I'm generalizing. There's some who come in and say, we need to be more transparent. We need to be more effective. We need to consult with people. We need to be out there for everything we do, talk to people. And then we have other people who come in and say, we need to be more like a business. Not necessarily business-like, which I think is good, but more like a business. We ought to look at user fees, user pay, We ought to go in and look at our services. So we're seeing across the country more service reviews, which I think is very healthy. Unfortunately, some of them have actually become service audits. Let's get in there, find out what's wrong, and change things. But service reviews, certainly service capacity reviews, as I call them, a very healthy thing to do. We also see changing dynamics, and you can say, well, what impact does that have? Well, when you see on average a 50% turnover, we're seeing kind of the old guard. Rural Canada may be a little slower than urban, but nevertheless it's happening. So we have aging people retiring from council. We see a gender change, more women on council. We see cultural shift. We see younger people. And so the changing dynamics, which is great, but it also creates more diversity of values, biases, and opinion. And of course, if we have not really equipped council to be able to have good debate, often they can result in arguments, and arguments often have collateral damage, in particular behavioral or personality clashes. So we have, again, just a reminder of what I think is, that fundamental paradox, contradiction. I don't think they have to be contradictions, but we're always balancing efficiency versus effectiveness. And often I'll see these values come to play in a discussion. And if we haven't had that discussion, and I have to tell you that often in our orientation programs, what do? We think about this. All across the country, councils get elected in October or November, except for New Brunswick. And the first thing we do is we get them to be at the end of a fire hose, especially the new councillors, right? With all the orientation. Here's everything you need to know. Here's the legislation. Here's all our services. Here's what we do, blah, blah. And then we drag them through a budget, and they have ideas, they have, hey, this is what I got elected on. These are the promises I made. These are the things that I said I could do. And somebody, particular wise CEO, gets the CFO to say, sorry, you can't do that. There's no room in the budget. So it's no wonder we kind of get off to a clash, sort of the new and old guard kind of clashing. We have administration and perhaps council kind of clashing just by the nature of our orientation and sort of the budget process. Where is it that we talked about, the values? And I'm not talking about big picture vision for the community. I understand that needs to come. But, what do we see? What are the values? What's important to us? How do we want to make decisions? How do we want to do things? And so often our orientations are administrative focused as opposed to political focused. So what does that mean? Well, consequently, often we get different characters, right? They didn't join up, as a fraternity or a social club. They got elected, and all of a sudden they're with people, and each one comes with different personality. Each person comes with different values, different biases, and you know this. In fact, your administration is the same. You have yourself a certain personality. And so often, if we don't have the tools, good process, good role clarity, good ways to check in and deal with things before they escalate, we can have conflict. And conflict has huge consequences. One, people feel bad, right? Just elected officials increasingly maybe don't have less regard for each other. We can get bad behaviors. We can have the council become kind of divided. Administrations see this, and so it reflects on how they feel about going to council. There can be interactions between council and staff that are behavioral based, that are not positive, and that can filter into staff, and the public see it. Perhaps more so than ever before, the public see this. So across the country, we have seen a decline in civility. Oh, sure. What do we do? Well, we go out, and now pretty much all across the country, you're required to have a code of conduct or codes of standards, et cetera. So everybody looks at them, signs them. We stole them from somewhere else, and everybody signs them. Unfortunately, they have really no enforcement. Increasingly, people are exploring ways to do that. I was just with some mayors last week in British Columbia, where some have ventured into some new areas around honoraria reductions, et cetera. So yet to be tested. So, if we have a decline in civility, all kinds of consequences, as I mentioned, and it just affects the organization. And you think, wow, if we get off to a bad start, wow, it's just going to be like 4 years. And I see a lot of counselors and elected officials saying, oh, okay, 3.5 years left, 3 years left. Staff, the same thing, right? Also, we're seeing that often and increasingly within 6 months of an election, we see people just saying, you know what, I'm packing it in. For others, it's the ship has just become immobile. Councils are not willing to get together to do strategy sessions. They don't want to sit down and have good discussions so that staff have some clarity around where they're, what's expected of them. And so we have a lot of uncertainty for administrations. And when I say administrations, I'll say CAO, but I'm really talking about, the one employee of council, but it really reflects for all of administration. So when administration is coming to council, I call it being on the end of the diving board, when you're presenting. There's a high degree of uncertainty, and because you're guessing what's on the mind of council. And if you guess right, it's actually equally dangerous as guessing wrong. When you guess wrong, it's pretty obvious. You're wrong, and it can hurt. You can, the sharks can come in for the kill. You fall in the water, so to speak, off the diving board. But also, if you're right, it can look like administration's running the show. So both sides of these are equal. So what happens is staff increasingly don't want to come out on the end of the diving board. So we lose the value of staff contribution to good governance. Now, recall, and I'm just going to repeat it very quickly. You already know this. I mean, the job of council is set direction, make decisions, and represent the public interest. Job of staff is to provide good advice, implement directions, and provide knowledge. But if there's a discord in that relationship, staff increasingly don't want to provide good advice, the complete advice, or the information perhaps that elected officials don't want to hear. So we have almost a kind of a protective attitude, hands off, like, okay, let's just let them do their thing. Like, we'll just provide our services, and whatever they say, we'll just kind of proceed. And so there's not a lot of, let's call it engagement, right? Just kind of let the dust settle and let's hope it all gets better. Or we have some administrations that, okay, well, if they're not going to set direction, we will. And we'll do that through the budget. We'll do that through business planning. And again, it can be perceived that administration's running the show, or that staff are ahead of council. Just working with one council where the feeling is that the budget is staff driven. Well, and then you deal with them and you say, well, where was it that you provided, the services that you want to take a close look at, or the tax rate band that you want to look at, or the priorities that you want to include. So increasingly, we have this notion of people not staying in their lane and CAOs needing to protect staff. So if a counselor, for example, has no rules of engagement, how to advance an idea, or how to gain some traction around a strategic issue that they have, they come into the kitchen with staff. And often it's, I believe people are good. It's often innocent. They come in looking for information that quickly becomes a research request. I think most counselors know you can't say to staff, you need to do this now. There's exceptions. It's more subtle than that. I think often they come in saying, hey, I was inquiring about the snow removal policy. What's that look like? Public information. But all of a sudden it becomes, well, how does that compare to other municipalities? What would happen if the response time was 50% quicker? Like if it was 48 hours and we made it 24, all of a sudden it becomes a work request. So often then CAOs everywhere across the country, the question often is the administration a good fit? Back to our behavioral and leadership approach, and as well strategy. And so when it's not a good fit, we only have kind of one option, right? It's not council that's going to disappear. It's not the mayor that's going to disappear. And hey, as we'll see very quickly, council really only has one employee. So we have this notion, at least for you and your administration. I say not just CAOs, but senior management, and I think any aspiring managers in local government. This term political acuity. It's a common word that we use, and it's a difficult one. So I know CAMA is just finished, Canadian Association of Municipal Administrators has finished kind of a guidebook on political acuity. It's that ability to navigate what I call the gray area between council staff relations. And of course, if we're not able to navigate, we know that when a small element meets a big element, often the little element is the one that suffers. And we have the result of increasingly a high amount of what I call CAO roadkill. Now, you may say, well, that's the CAO. Yeah, no, I understand. There are times when CAO, it's a performance related or whatever. But when I say the CAO roadkill, it's really a reflection on administration, right? It's a reflection that administration is not aligned. And since there is no what I call traffic cop, although increasingly across the country, we're seeing the rise of integrity commissioners. But generally, we need to find our own methods. There's not some external source that's going to come in and solve our alignment issue. And here's the thing, as I talk to councils and of course administrations, I talk about alignment. If you're driving a vehicle and the wheels aren't aligned, we put a lot of wear and tear on the tires, use excess gas, put a lot of energy into keeping it on the road. And that's energy and resources being siphoned from what we need to be doing. So to me, the key word in everything we do is alignment. And it's not just within that, that orientation period. It's a continuous process. Because often we don't see, anywhere you go, playgrounds, a pool, or any hockey game, a football game, it doesn't matter. You see rules of engagement. And I get that we see the standards of conduct, but if we don't really have a clarity around what's appropriate, how do we guide our behavior, have a roadmap of how things work, then we need to be able to kind of look for other tools. So one, of course, is having a strategy all across the country, just on average, other than the requirement for the gas tax money to see an integrated community sustainability plan, probably only about 50% have a strategic plan. Of those, 50% can't find it. And of the many of them, you could drive a truck through. They're so vague. You can only say economic viability, healthy active lifestyles, reliable infrastructure, so many ways before they all look the same. So how do we take a council vision, if we're back to the vehicle, the windshield, that vision, and cascade it into meaningful priorities that match our capacity? How do we truly, on a consistent basis, monitor and promote role clarity? And we're going to find out very quickly. The hourglass is a typical scenario. I want to show you a different one very shortly. Because without that, what we can often have is council, well-meaning or not, getting involved in administrivia, coming into the kitchen, looking around, looking for information, just trying to help, or forensic look, doesn't matter. But also equally important is we can have staff without that clarity of roles, strategy, etc., processes, trying to guess what's on the mind of council. Or in many of our small communities, let's face it, talking directly to elected officials and getting some perspective. And so we begin to see that we have this role confusion, not because people are bad, but often because processes don't work. So how is it that we can have kind of regular check-ins, not wait for that moment when everything kind of blows up, but that we can kind of have regular check-ins. So the CAO doesn't have to guess. I often ask CAOs, how do you know if you're doing okay? And they say, well, I might have an evaluation once a year. I can kind of get a sense just reading the room. So I want to leave you with a different idea. Rather than guessing if everything's okay, why don't we structure it a little more and have a check-in? Because you know what? If council or administration doesn't have a vehicle to express their concerns, to express their perceptions of misalignment, they'll find another way to do it. And that is either they'll take it out on each other in a council meeting, they'll take it out on staff when they're on the end of the diving board, they'll do it in the coffee shop, they'll do it in social media, hey, And of course, we need to find a way to do that. Well, we can have just check-ins. I find if you just do a check-in with no structure, it can be a dangerous exercise. You can have what I call the downward spiral discussion, with no framework. But if we could have a bit of a dashboard that said, hey, what would good governance, what would good role process look like? What would good role clarity look like? Whenever somebody is bringing up an issue, a challenge, in perhaps a negative way, we can say, okay, let's go to our dashboard and say, how can we make that look better? Well, to do that, it requires a bit of a foundation of understanding that perhaps complements the work that you've already done in the orientation. So over time, developed a bit of a framework, and you can see the black and white, right? Job of council, let's repeat, set direction, make policy, represent the public interest. Role of staff, provide advice, implement direction, and provide knowledge. And so typically we would expect, hey, council is the only legitimate body in your community to set the direction. And day in, day out, the primary role of government at the grassroots is to provide services. So we sort of have this black and white, if you want to call it that. So when the direction's not clear, staff, well-meaning, will go into the political realm, the top, and begin to guess or direct or provide that direction, that advice that maybe is too strong. Of course, if council is not in the strategic realm, you have to wonder where it is. Well, think about it. When, Councillor Joe is walking down the street, good odds Mary doesn't say, hey, I've been reading your strategic plan. Goal number 3, objective number 7. Please tell me more about it. I'd love to hear more about it. No, When Councillor Joe's walking down the street, Mary wants to know, hey, when's the dirt on the streets going to get swept? Hey, when's the pool going to open, etc. So it's very easy for a councillor to get sucked into the service delivery realm, which they have every right to do, of course, with inquiries or complaints. But we need to find a way to kind of quickly get them out. Why? Again, because they're in the grassroots. Is that here are all the functions. Here's all the services we provide. Great. So now what do we do with that? Well, within each service, not just theoretical and generally, we can actually take what is the role of council? What is the role of staff when it comes to strategy, when it comes to policy or decision making or meetings or service delivery or our systems, personnel, budget, financial management? Well, without to drag us all through the mud, I've been able to do that numerous times to then say in those four functions, strategy, policy, services, and systems, what does success look like? How would we describe what success looks like? So that way, on a continuous basis, not just at the orientation, we can actually have check-ins. I'm an advocate quarterly, right? That we check in and say, hey, we should first of all celebrate what's working well, but also, is there anything problematic? Because when burrs occur, these little things, they fester. One person has a concern, they talk to another counselor, and all of a sudden we've got group think. So our job, I think, as administration, is to help council close the gap through some kind of dialogue in where they might be misaligned on values, biases, strategy, communication, etc. And of course, that also implies the same between council and staff. So over time, developed a bit of a hit list. And happy to make sure you get this. I know working with Richard, this will be available to you. I have a monogram called What's Black and White and Gray All Over. And so you don't have to, you can take a screenshot if you want, but you'll have this in your package. So let's review. These are all things that you probably covered in your orientation, roles and responsibilities. If we have a plan or some priorities, are we sticking to them? Do we know what they are? And are they cascading into action plans? Are we ensuring that council knows we are accountable for performance? Hopefully they don't have to get involved other than the CAO in that endeavor, but making sure that they're comfortable that there is accountability. I'm going to come back to number 5 in a minute. Of course, making sure that we can demonstrate efficiency. Remember that business aspect of efficiency. Are we making sure that they have adequate information, and are they able to have good debate? The two fundamental principles, I believe, adequate information and good debate for informed agreement. Do we have good communication, particularly within council, between council staff, between meetings, during meetings? Notice there's only one value on here, and that's respect for opinions, diverse opinions. And often I'll see values. We value openness, we value honesty, we value, etc. I get those, but I think it's important to get more to some specifics that mean something. And of course, a couple others that we're seeing across all organization is our job as leaders, both administrative and political, is to ensure some sense of stability and not chaos in our organization. And of course, ensure we have good service delivery, one of our fundamental roles in society. But let me come back to number 5, because often council will say, well, what business do we have relative to the workplace and work environment? And I say, hey, If every meeting let's assume for a minute you have some priorities, and if every council meeting you're coming up with 5, 6 more to-do items, requests, or you have discord in your council meetings, or perhaps you're criticizing staff when they make recommendations. These are all have an impact on morale. And I believe municipalities, they get a reputation, right? So when you're posting a position, hey, that's not a place that you want to go. And it doesn't matter what level. So the idea of having a dashboard or a checklist, well, what do you do with it? And notice it was very brief, not a lot of detail. As you unpack it, the details will come out. So I'm an advocate that every once in a while, we ought to stop our busyness, our business meetings, our in-camera meeting, our strategy work, all that stuff, and just stop and say, how are we doing? Because let's face it, it's a relationship. It's a relationship for 4 years. So for example, we might say, what works well, we should celebrate, right? Things that are doing well. And is there anything that we need to attend to? Is there anything that we need to do more of? Is there anything not working well? Well, in this case, one of the things often again that I'm hearing is we don't have enough time just to strategize, just to have good discussion. And so if you don't close that gap, guess what? It was actually a futile conversation. In fact, doing a check-in will end very quickly because nothing ever happened. So in this case, they looked and said, you know what? They had a practice, which many of us do, of committee of the whole. And the committee of the whole, unfortunately, was becoming a dress rehearsal for the business meeting, not a strategy session. So they decided we're going to refresh our intent for committee of the whole. Many of us use a staff report, a request for decision. But staff were saying, sometimes at that last council meeting when you said we ought to do something about affordable housing, like, what do you mean? Social housing, emergency housing, market housing, employee housing? And so a couple of years ago, I developed a different form called the request for direction or clarity. And of course, they also decided to have a regular schedule. In short, they brought up a concern and unpacked it to be able to develop something, to do something about it. Otherwise, it just festers. So in that way, it's a way to perhaps on an ongoing basis help everybody, not just administration, but everybody navigate the gray. Now, one of the things often people ask me is if we're going to do a check-in, okay, Gordon, I kind of hear what you're saying. I'm buying it a little bit. Okay, that's great. I'm an advocate, though, that it's only the CAO and council. A CAO can do this anytime, right? And because, and again, not a legal perspective here, I'm not a lawyer, but I think anytime council can sit down with the CAO and talk about performance, right? How are we doing? I think that enables us to use one of the L's. Remember in camera, land, legal, labor. So under labor, we can talk about how's the organization doing, which impacts the CAO's performance. And so I think there's some legitimacy for going in camera. Kind of flippantly, but seriously, I give it the fourth L. So there's land, legal, labor, and now laundry. Where is it that we are able to safely do our laundry? And so we don't have to do it in front of staff. We don't have to do it in front of the public, and we can nip things before they escalate. So hopefully a little bit of context for you to kind of think about the world of political administrative interface. Hopefully some ideas that, because I know you know a lot of this, but maybe it's some ways or concepts that you can explain it to other people, both staff and council, and also hopefully perhaps a tool that you can continue your journey to navigate the gray. Thanks so much for taking some time in your conference to hear some thoughts. And if you have thoughts or ideas or things that you'd like to share that I'm able to share with other places across the country, I'd love to hear them. Thanks so much for your time.